And I am so grateful for this movement as a person who grew up in affordable housing here in Brookline. I can say I would not be here if it were not for the iteration of housing justice warriors championing this cause in the 70s, which created the opportunity for my parents to move from under the thumb of a terribly racist landlord in Mattapan, the trauma of which my mother still speaks about to this day, to a diverse new life here in Brookline. May we be strengthened in this work for the sake of the future generations who need us to be strong. And now I am pleased to turn this over to your moderator for the evening, Pulitzer Prize finalist Abdullah Fayed from the Boston Globe.
Hi, everyone. Hey. So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to Abundant Housing Massachusetts and everybody else who organized this event tonight and putting it together. And I also want to thank them for inviting me to moderate. I also want to thank Rabbi Berenbaum for introducing me, and a big thanks to Temple Beth Zion for hosting us tonight. Also, on a personal note, I've always wanted to have a bar mitzvah of my own. So now that I'm standing here behind a podium at a synagogue, I want to thank you for that as well. So we're here tonight to talk about residential segregation, how we got here, and how we can begin to undo it. You know, this is an extremely important issue to all of us, both here in Greater Boston and the country as a whole. America's federal and local housing policies have been, without a doubt, one of the main drivers of racial inequality over the last 100 years. And in fact, housing and land ownership more broadly have long been a principal tool of establishing and preserving racial and class hierarchies here in the United States. Now, a lot of people today think our still largely segregated society is a result of market forces, with maybe some individual cases of racism and classism here and there that might be to blame. But when I was reporting out one of my first articles that I ever wrote as a journalist, which happened to be on this very topic, I came across a speech from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that I think encapsulated just how much the government, the federal government, engineered residential segregation into existence. In it, he likened America's slums to a, quote, system of internal colonialism not unlike the exploitation of the Congo by Belgium. Now, the reason I revisited that article as I was preparing for this evening is because while he almost certainly or definitely will not remember this, Richard Rothstein was actually one of my main sources for that story. I asked him back then why there's such little political support for race-conscious policies that would actively integrate our neighborhoods. And he told me it's because, quote, we've adopted this myth that government wasn't responsible for segregation, and so there's no governmental responsibility for undoing it, end quote. His last book, The Color of Law, has actually played a big role in beginning to dismantle that myth. So to kick off tonight's discussion, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Richard Rothstein, who, in addition to being a source for one of my stories, which I like to think is his main claim to fame, he'll probably disagree. Richard is also the co-author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, and the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America. He also writes a regular column, which you can subscribe to for free at justaction.substack.com. The pivot to Substack is real. He is a distinguished fellow of Economic Policy Institute, a senior fellow emeritus of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. Please join me in welcoming Richard Rothstein to the podium.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Do you have your notebook out? thanks to all of you for coming here this evening to engage in this discussion with me. As Abdullah mentioned, and I think many of you from the conversations I've had before this event started are familiar with the fact that in 2017, I wrote a book called The Color of Law, whose goal was to demolish the myth of de facto segregation, a term that I had used that I think all of us are familiar with. Most of us probably used it. De facto segregation means the fact that we're an apartheid society, not because of government rules the way they have in South Africa, but just because of accidents, private individuals, bigoted homeowners not willing to sell to African Americans, or maybe businesses in the private sector like real estate agents or developers discriminating in how they did their private business, or maybe just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe it's all because of economic differences, market forces, as you said. That's de facto segregation, and it's a widely shared notion. It turns out to be it's a complete myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. The reason we're segregated today in this country is because of racially explicit, unconstitutional, and unlawful policies practiced by federal, state, and local governments, all designed in the 20th century to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another anywhere in any metropolitan area of this country. Those policies that government followed were so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape of today. Now, I'm not here to talk about that book because I persuaded my daughter to join with me in writing a sequel. I'll come to that in a minute, but I just want to begin by giving you a little bit of background about the first book for those of you who haven't read it. Let me describe one of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed in order to ensure that we be racially segregated. In the post-World War II period, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations embarked on a policy to move the entire white middle-class and working-class populations out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was a racially explicit policy. At the time, we were a manufacturing economy. Some of you are too young to remember that, but we used to make things in this country. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts to ship their final products. So both blacks and whites were living in urban areas, frequently in very close proximity, much closer proximity than they are today. They had to be able to walk to work. Most of them didn't have automobiles. They, the banks and the other service industries also had to be located in these downtown areas. So we were an urban economy. In the immediate post-World War II period, returning war veterans, black and white, were coming home, taking jobs in the post-war boom, and the federal government decided to suburbanize the whites who were returning, as well as whites who were already living in urban areas, into single-family homes. In The Color of Law, I use as an example, perhaps the most famous example is Levittown, east of New York City. You've probably all heard of it, but it's duplicated here in the Boston area and suburbs around here, as well as everywhere in the country. 17,000 homes in Levittown, all in one place, east of New York City. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes, to buy the land and build those homes. The banks thought he was crazy. We weren't a suburban country. Nobody was going to want to live in one of these places, they thought. So he couldn't get the loans. The only way he could build this development, and this is true of developers all over the country, was to go to the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, ask them to guarantee his bank loans. They did so, provided he would never sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home, prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out in an FHA manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate applications of builders to develop these subdivisions. and recommend or not recommend them for a federal bank guarantee. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that's going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a bank guarantee a project that was going to be only for whites if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. This is what federal policy was, written federal policy. This notion of de facto segregation, as I said, is utter nonsense. Without that policy, we would not have all white suburbs today. It's a creation of the federal government. Now, as I wrote in The Color of Law, those homes that were built, the suburban homes that were built in the 1940s and 50s were inexpensive. It's hard to believe it now, but those homes, those suburban single-family homes sold at the time for $100,000 in today's money. Actually, $8,000 or $9,000 at that time. $100,000. Anybody with a job in the post-war economy, black or white, could afford a home for $100,000. It's about twice national median income. Whites could afford it. Blacks could afford it. Whites were permitted to buy them. Blacks were not permitted to buy them. Well, those homes, as you probably know, I might be telling you something you don't already know, but those homes no longer sell for $100,000 in suburbs all over this country. They sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, sometimes $1 million or more in some areas of the country, $100,000 homes. The whites who bought those homes with federal bank with federal mortgages, federally insured mortgages, subsidies by the government, the whites who bought those homes didn't know they were going to get rich by moving to these very modest small homes in the suburbs. That wasn't the idea. This happened subsequently without anybody's expectation. They just wanted a place to live. But the result was that because of the enormous appreciation in the value of those homes, white families became wealthy. They gained appreciation, the difference between what they paid, $100,000, and the present value of their homes, accumulate wealth. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps temporary emergencies like unemployment maybe for a short term or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements over and above what Social Security provided. And most importantly, they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had money for down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that generated all this wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about that. You'll have to invite me back to give a different lecture on the income inequality. But you'd think that if the income ratio was 60%, the wealth ratio would be about 60% as well. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes, household incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And when I say it determines the racial landscape of today, it's precisely because of the ongoing wealth gap that that federal policy created. Were it not for that, we would not have the segregated society that we have today. Well, that was only one federal program that created segregation. There were many others. I'll give one other example and then move on to the sequel. Another is public housing, something we all think we know about. We think public housing is for poor people. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in the housing shortage of the Depression. No housing was being constructed. Middle-class families could afford housing, but there was no housing available. The first New Deal program of the Public Works Administration, the Roosevelt administration, and the New Deal was a public housing program. Separate projects all over the country for whites and for blacks. Actually, many more for whites than for blacks, but separate projects here in Boston, around the country. Some of you may remember reading or have read about or maybe if you're old enough, remember reading it in the paper about the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis. The projects eventually were all black, even though they started out as black and white, and they became so dysfunctional because it concentrated only the poor in a single place. They became so dysfunctional that public housing came to be demolished. But it wasn't the Pruitt-Igoe projects. It began as two separate projects. Pruitt was for whites, Igoe was for African Americans. And as the whites were subsidized to move out of public housing into the suburban communities I talked about, you had a situation where there were large vacancies in Pruitt and long waiting lists for Igoe. It was an unsustainable situation. The public housing authorities could no longer defend having one project that was half empty and the other project with long waiting lists. So both projects were now open to African Americans. As more and more middle-class families were subsidized to leave, they became places of concentrated poverty and disadvantage and dysfunctional. Well, the subtitle of The Color of Law was a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. It wasn't a hidden history. Back in the day, everybody knew this. If you bought a home, a suburban home, you knew that your deed said that you couldn't sell a home to an African American. Nothing hidden about that. If you lived in public housing, white or black, you knew you were living in a segregated project, segregated by policy, not by accident. So this is not I didn't uncover any mysterious hidden policy that the government was following. This was racially explicit and well known. We've forgotten it because we think it didn't happen that way, and there's no, as Abdullah said, there's no obligation to do something about it if the government didn't create it. Well, I wrote this book. I gave lots of talks like this about The Color of Law. Many people read it. It did surprisingly well in terms of sales. And frequently, people who read it or came to talks like this said to me, well, what can we do about it? What can we do about it now? Okay, you explained that it's unconstitutional. It's an illegal residential system that we have. What can we do about it? Well, I realized that much as I wanted to retire, I had to write another book. And the new book is called Just Action. I know history, as I wrote in The Color of Law, but I didn't know much about housing policy. I knew some, but not a whole lot. So I had to recruit a co-author. I searched all around the country for the best co-author I could find, hired a search firm, and they came up with my daughter, Leah Rothstein, who after years of pestering, agreed to quit her job and come work with me full-time on this book and now crusade. So we published a new book called Just Action, How to Challenge the Segregation Created Under the Color of Law. And I want to describe in the minutes I have this evening some of the things that Just Action talks about. Our underlying assumption, which the book describes, is that there is no political will in this country today, political possibility of enacting significant national policy to redress racial segregation. But once the government has established a system of apartheid, as it has done, many local policies and programs and practices sustain and reinforce it and maintain it. So there's a lot that can be done by what we refer to as a reinvigorated civil rights movement to redress segregation at the local level with groups like yours that come together on a biracial, multi-ethnic basis to organize as I said, a reinvigorated civil rights movement to take action at a local level, which is conceivable and possible and can be done to redress racial segregation. Well, let me describe a few of the policies, programs, practices that exist at a local level that are within your grasp if you decide to organize to change them. One of them that is not terribly well known, but some of you may have read about this. Our property tax system is racially discriminatory. It's racially discriminatory, not in intent, because once you've established, as I say, an apartheid system, there are many policies that might be race neutral on their face and in intent that will nonetheless have a disparate impact and reinforce segregation. Well, why is the property tax system racially discriminatory? Why do African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate than white property owners do? This is, by the way, true everywhere in the country. It's been documented throughout the country in Just Action. There are sources that you can find that will take you to the documentation. The reasons, once you think about it, are fairly easy to understand. Properties in white neighborhoods, predominantly white neighborhoods, appreciate in value faster than properties in black neighborhoods do. So if you don't do an annual visual property assessment, and most cities and counties don't do a reassessment every year, over time, the market value of homes in white neighborhoods are going to be higher relative to their assessed value as those assessed values grow more out of date than the market value of homes in black neighborhoods are to the assessed values of their homes. The result is that African Americans are paying a higher property tax rate than white homeowners relative to the value of their homes. This is well known by tax assessors. We quote in Just Action, the book, a statement made by the county assessor of Cook County in Illinois, Chicago, in which he says, yes, the system is discriminatory and African Americans are entitled to refunds. But no refunds have been forthcoming, and they won't be forthcoming unless there's an active, reinvigorated civil rights movement that's going to create the political pressure, not just in Cook County, but everywhere in the country to address it. I'll give you another example of a race-neutral policy that I think some of you may be familiar with that is discriminatory, and that's the credit scoring system that's used to evaluate the eligibility of a potential homeowner to buy a home. As you know, when you apply for a mortgage, you get a credit score by three agencies, three companies that collect data on your past fidelity in paying back loans that you've taken out. When they calculate the credit score, if you've owned a previous home and you've paid your mortgage on time, you get points towards a good credit score if you've always made your mortgage payments on time. African Americans, 40% of them are homeowners today. 70% of whites are homeowners today. So it's much more likely that even if there were no economic qualifications involved, it's much more likely that a white trying to apply for a mortgage has had a previous mortgage than it is for an African American who's applying for a mortgage has probably not had a previous mortgage. Well, the banks consider mortgage payments on time as a indication of your having good credit, your likelihood to pay back a new mortgage. If you've been a renter, however, and all your life have made every single rental payment on time, you get absolutely no credit towards your rental score. Rental payments aren't considered. Only mortgage payments are considered. It's in effect a racially discriminatory system, but it's not intended to be that way. The reasons that it's set up that way is because it's so easy to collect evidence of timely mortgage payments. There are only a few major institutions in the country, a couple of dozen, that issue mortgages. They electronically submit records of applicants for mortgages as to their fidelity in paying back past mortgage obligations. It's easy to collect for these companies to do credit scores, but there are hundreds of thousands of landlords in this country. And it takes some effort to collect evidence of people's past rental payments, so it's not collected. The result is that African Americans who have perfectly good credit records rather, don't get good credit scores because their rental payments have not been paid. Now, there's a national organization, you probably heard it referred to, it's a semi-governmental organization that backs up banks that issue mortgages. It replenishes their mortgage funds so they can issue new mortgages. It's called Fannie Mae, the Federal National Mortgage Association. Fannie Mae, a few years ago, did a study of rental payments and eligibility for mortgages. It found that nationwide, over the past 3 years, this was a study it published in think 21, I think it's 2021. They announced on the basis of examining their records and data that over the past 3 years, 17% of all those households that had been denied mortgages when they applied would have received them if their rental payments had been considered. Now, I read this announcement by Fannie Mae, and I figured, if Fannie Mae knows that 17% of mortgage applicants who were denied mortgages would have had them if their rental payments had been considered, Fannie Mae must know who these people are. And the local banks must know who these people are. And nothing's going to happen to compensate them for this discriminatory denial unless there's a civil rights movement that's going to create the pressure on them to make this amends, to either compensate the people who are denied mortgages or give them preferential treatment if they apply again. This is another kind of policy, local, because it's local banks that issue these mortgages, local credit unions that issue these mortgages that could be held to account by a new civil rights movement. I'll give you another example. In 2019, this is fairly recent again, maybe some of you have read about this, a newspaper on Long Island, New York, Long Island Newsday. It's a fairly established, well-known newspaper on Long Island, engaged in something called paired testing of real estate agents on Long Island. Paired testing is a system where usually it's fair housing centers that do this. You send matched applicants to a realtor or to a landlord. One black, one white, go relatively nearby, but not the same time, with identical financial histories, identical occupational backgrounds, and see if they're treated differently. Long Island Newsday went so far as, the editor of Long Island Newsday went so far as to go to Nordstrom's and buy identical handbags for the black and white applicants for homes or clients of real estate agents. And what Long Island Newsday found was in 50% of the interactions that African Americans had with real estate agents, they experienced discrimination. Now, somebody who goes and visits a real estate agent and tries to ask for help in finding a home, they don't know that they're discriminated against. How are they going to know that the neighborhoods in which they're shown houses are different from the neighborhoods that whites are shown houses? They don't know unless they would have no way of knowing. So they don't know that they're experiencing discrimination. The only way that this kind of discrimination can be uncovered, and it's not just real estate agents, it's landlords as well, landlords who treat people who call up wanting to rent an apartment with an African-American sounding name, and someone who calls up wanting to rent the same apartment with a Anglo name. They don't, the people who do this don't know that they're being treated differently, that the first one is told that the apartment has just been rented and is no longer available, and the second one is given the opportunity to rent it. People have no way of knowing they're experiencing this discrimination. But if in 50% on Long Island, New York, of the interactions with real estate agents, and the same thing is true of landlords, if 50% of them are experiencing discrimination, you can imagine that it's true elsewhere in the country, here and everywhere else, in the Boston metropolitan area and everywhere else. Well, again, fair housing centers are the only ones who are doing this kind of pair testing. Long Island News, they actually hired unemployed actors. You don't have that everywhere. There's a pool of, but anybody can volunteer. If any member of a activist group can volunteer to be a tester for a local fair housing center. And the fair housing centers are bereft of funds to do this kind of testing. They do very little of it. If they do any at all, they test only landlords and not realtors, because it's much easier to sit at the phone and call up a landlord to see if an apartment is available than to go with a matching handbag to a real estate office. So fair housing centers do very little of it. They need help, they need support, they need financial resources, kind of financial resources that people like yourselves can help to develop to enable this testing to go on. And the real estate agents and the landlords who are practicing this kind of discrimination should be held to account. If necessary, have their licenses lifted if they are found to be discriminating. This is now 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So it's, I think it's a little bit late to say, well, we just need to do a better job of educating them about their responsibilities. Well, this is another case, and I say I could go on and on about these local issues that are actionable at a local level. Just Action, the book is filled with many, many of them. We divide the policies that we discuss in two different categories. One are policies to increase resources in existing low-income Black neighborhoods. The other are policies to open up white, usually suburban neighborhoods to African-American residents. There are dozens of these kinds of actions that can be taken, policies that can be pursued that are yours for the asking if you simply decide to engage in this kind of activity. Now, I know that I'm running out of time, but let me just say briefly, and then I think there'll be a question period, maybe we'll talk more about it. I know that right now, here in Brookline and in other communities along the light rail and other T stations are being required by the state of Massachusetts to do some upzoning around the stations. And that's important. Zoning reform is another thing that is essential if we're going to redress segregation, both in urban areas and in suburban areas. But it's not sufficient. Zoning reform is a first step. We need to increase density in all kinds of communities, not just along light rail stations. But it's not going to redress segregation. In preparation for coming here tonight, I tried to read as many Boston Globe articles as I could of the last few months about what's going on with this requirement. And the thing that struck me the most, I guess, was a statement by the town manager of Lexington, who said that he agreed with this program. He said the upzoning was important. He said because the biggest problem that Lexington has is that the children of people who live in Lexington can't afford to come back and live in their community. And seniors in Lexington whose children have left have no opportunity to downsize because there are no smaller units available. Now, this is not a unique approach of the town manager of Lexington. This is actually the motivation behind a lot of the zoning reform in this country today. There's a national organization that's been created to press for zoning reform. It's called YIMBYs, Yes in My Backyard. And it's an organization of young professionals, mostly white and Asian, who can't afford to live in the communities where they grew up. And we have a middle-class housing crisis as well as a low-income housing crisis. In Just Action, we talk at length about the mistaken notion that most African Americans are poor. And that if simply we create affordable housing for low-income families, we're going to be addressing segregation, the issue of segregation. Most African Americans are not poor. Most African Americans in this country have jobs. They earn wages. They can afford housing if it was available. They don't need the kinds of subsidies that the lowest income families have, but they are still priced out of housing, as are whites, middle class households priced out of housing. If all we do is increase the amount of housing, it'll take a long, long time because before any of that becomes available to African Americans, does anything to redress segregation. Now, I don't have time to go into it now, but my favorite chapter in this new book, Just Action, is one, and I'll just whet your appetite a little bit for it. It's one that we call Dare to Defy. And it's about the 150-year history of the US Supreme Court that has annihilated the meaning of the 13th and 14th Amendments to this country. We cannot succeed in redressing segregation without being intentionally racially explicit about it. We need to create, simply increasing, as I said, the supply of housing is going to mostly benefit whites. who are going to outbid African Americans. African American middle-class families are segregated. They live in neighborhoods with much higher poverty rates than whites who have exactly the same incomes. They live in neighborhoods that are much closer to low-income neighborhoods than whites who have incomes that are identical. And they have no opportunities for the kind of housing that they need any more than whites do, but whites are going to be able to outbid them if all we do is create duplexes and triplexes in places where they're presently not permitted. Well, I won't go on and on about that now, but I just want to plant that idea in your head. I hope that in addition to demolishing the myth of de facto segregation, this new book will do something to demolish the myth that African Americans and poor people are the same thing. If we're going to redress segregation, we need to do it across the class spectrum and not just for poor people. Well, there are many, many other policies in Just Action that we describe. I don't want to take up too much more of your time now. I hope you'll read the book and use it to help you design actions that are different in every place. We don't have a recommendation in this book about where you should start. Every community is different. The interests of every local group are different. But what's important is that you start somewhere. And I think all of you are here because you have started somewhere and are interested in starting somewhere. And hopefully Just Action will give you more ideas than you presently have about ways that you can approach it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So our next speaker is Dr. Kariyln Crockett. Unfortunately for me, Kariyln has not yet been a source for one of my stories, but I'm hoping that'll change. So Kariyln, I'm just going to subtly leave my contact information at this podium in case you ever want to call me up and talk about housing. I'm excited about introducing Kariyln because before moving to Boston, I lived in Washington, D.C., which has a very rich history of highway resistance movements, something I was fascinated by because that had clearly served the city well. Unlike many other American cities, DC mostly avoided getting sliced up and segregated by a series of massive urban highways. To be sure, that doesn't mean that DC isn't segregated. It actually is very sharply segregated. But those highway resistance movements helped improve housing density in the city's walkability, and hopefully they will make future fixes to segregation just that much easier to implement. As it so happens, Kariyln's new book looks at highway resistance efforts here in Boston. It's called People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, and a New Movement for City Making. The book investigates a 1960s era grassroots movement to halt urban extension of US interstate highway systems and the geographic and political changes in Boston that resulted in. Now, for background, Kariyln's research focuses on large-scale land use changes in the 20th century American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Kariyln was the co-founder of the multicultural youth tour of What's Now, or My Town, an award-winning Boston-based educational nonprofit organization. My Town hired public high school students to research their local and family histories to produce youth-led walking tours for sale to produce youth-led walking tours for sale to public audiences. During its nearly 15 years of operation, My Town created jobs for more than 300 low and moderate income teenagers who in turn led public walking tours for more than 14,000 visitors and residents. In a White House ceremony, the National Endowment for the Humanities cited My Town as, quote, one of the 10 best youth humanities programs in America. Kariyln holds a PhD from the American Studies program at Yale University, a Master's of Science in Geography from the London School of Economics, and a Master of Arts and Religion from Yale Divinity School. Kariyln recently concluded 4 years of service with the Mayor's Office of Economic Development as the Director of Economic Policy and Research and the Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston. She is currently a lecturer in public policy and urban planning at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Kariyln's career mission is to continue to work at the nexus of education economic development, and urban revitalization. The last thing she needs to do is talk to me for a story. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kariyln Crockett.
Good evening. Guys, how is everyone? Good? It's really good to be here and to just be in community with all of you. I have been looking forward to this event for weeks now, and it just feels really special to be in community with Temple Beth Zion. But I have to say that when I got the email inviting me to sit on a panel with Richard Rothstein, I kind of did a double take on the email, thinking that it had to be a typo, an error. Maybe the email was misdirected, because it is incredible. It is absolutely an honor and a privilege to sit with this thinker, this mind, this witness, and this voice for justice and truth in our country. So, Richard, thank you for being here, and thank you for your work. Yes. Absolutely. So very humbling, because I am still a student of the law, of policy, of history. And even though I am now a professor at MIT, where I'm a professor of urban history, planning and public policy, I still feel like there's so much to know. And there's so much to learn, not just from our history, I mean, what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, but from our yearning for corrective action, our yearning for lessons and stories from our past, from our families, from our neighbors, that tell us that something else is possible. When so many times the stories of history seems like it seems like there's nothing else we can do. It was inevitable, and we know that that is absolutely not the case. And so I appreciate being in community with so many people who know that there is more, that there is another way for us to proceed. And so even from the name, Abundant Housing, Massachusetts, there's like a poetry in that. And I know that there was some intentionality in the choice of the word abundant. And so I want to just appreciate that, because this lie of scarcity is something that seems like will threaten to do us all in. So lifting up all of the witness, all of the voices, all of the sense of and commitment to possibility, to abundance, to a different way forward, is so much of what I think has informed my path. My own story as a daughter of the city of Boston. I grew up in Boston, born and raised in Dorchester, the biggest neighborhood, the best neighborhood, the most diverse neighborhood, all of that, right? So I have to say that. And so what has been striking for me, and I appreciate the chance for you to hear a little bit about my bio, is there has been a lot of school in my journey. Probably too much school, in fact. My family would agree with that. But the story of so much school is really the story of a neighborhood kid growing up in Dorchester, trying to understand what is it about our city that is so divided, that is so exclusive, that is so resistant to sharing all of the bounty and all the abundance of an incredible world-class city like Boston with everyone else. Why is it that our story is of lack, is of resistance, is of violence? My own family came to Boston in the 1950s from Excelsior, West Virginia, which is a tiny, tiny, but powerful coal mining community in the segregated South. My family comes here in the 50s hoping for so much opportunity, so much promise for so many of us. And they did not find that here. What they found in Boston in the 50s was a city that was closed to them, was closed to educational opportunity, was closed to job opportunity, was closed to housing provision. And so what that required was for my family to double down in thinking about, again, possibility and abundance. And so much of my own story is a story of folks who said no, who organized and who pulled together. And so some of what I had always wanted to know, and I still want to know, is what else can we do? And what else can we learn again about the past, about the sense of possibility? And so much of that fueled my time in grad school. It fueled my curiosity about this one story of a time in the 1960s when people came together and they said no. They said no to a technocratic future that denied their lives. They said no to a racially exclusive path that would say no to so many more families. And so many of you know this story. The story of the Boston anti-highway movement is this story of abundance, is this story of possibility, and a story that totally fascinated me as someone who didn't really even know this story, but as someone who was a beneficiary of so many activists from Boston, from Cambridge, from Brookline, from Somerville, from all over the region that said, you know what, there is a different way. And so we stand on not only their shoulders, but we stand in a metropolitan region that tells a different kind of story and truth. And I think the curiosity of not just the past, but again, how can we learn from these moments where there was something else revealed to us is still unfolding. And so this project to kind of understand Boston's anti-highway history was a project that began as a tiny seminar paper in grad school, and it grew from 15 pages to 20 pages, and then to a dissertation, and then to a book, which is not so new, but thank you. It's about 5 years old now, but the story still rings out for us. Many of you know this story. Clearance for I-95 would begin in Boston in about 1966. And for many folks in Boston at this time, the city was starting to empty out after World War II. People were starting to move to the suburbs. There were still a lot of people in the city, but a lot of folks, particularly white folks and families, were leaving. The city was scrambling, to say the least, to figure out how to bring more people into the city, how to make the city attractive for families, for working people, and for middle class people. And for some strange reason, people around the country really thought that highways were the way to bring people together. What? That highways were the ways for cities to make money. That highways represented a new kind of economics of possibility. Well, we all know that that was not only not true, but it was egregiously wrong, misguided, and violent. So the ways that the federal interstate highway system sort of opened up dislocation, opened up trauma in so many cities across the country is not a new story, but is a story that we can be proud to say that in the city of Boston, we said no to that. And so when President Eisenhower signs off on the 1956 Federal Highway Act, it released this absolute rainfall of money to cities all across the country, to the tune of 90 cents on the dollar. Your city would be reimbursed for highway development. There was no comparable funding for mass transit or public transit. And so that is a story within itself. So when the folks in Boston see that the roads and actually land is cleared, houses are lost, businesses are lost, in the stretch of land between Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, the South End, and even parts of Hyde Park, this would be the pathway that was going to connect what would have been the last 10 miles of I-95. So all of you know that I-95 goes in a pretty much continuous loop, actually a ribbon, kind of a straight line, from Maine to Florida. And in that ribbon, there are 2 breaks. Does anyone know what the other one is? Or does anyone know what they are? I want to guess. There are 2 breaks in I-95 on the eastern seaboard. Washington, D.C., sadly, no, that's not it. Any other guesses? Philadelphia, New Jersey Turnpike, it should be, but it's not, right? So the deal with I-95 is it goes through mostly these big capital cities, right? These port places. So you can go into New York, you can go into Newark, you could go into Providence, and all the way down, right? And so the 2 breaks in I-95 is right here, Boston, So you ever notice that? So you go around the city, you can get on the Mass Pike and go on 90, but you cannot go into downtown Boston on 95. It's very confusing if you're in a car, even if your GPS is going to know if you're supposed to be going north or south, because there's this loop, there's this, right? Exactly, you've experienced that. Yet you do not come into downtown. And that was by design, because activists, coalition builders, the coalition of the willing, we could even say, like the people in this room, said no to that. And through persistence and through organizing, and through very much direct action, rallies, letters, talking to several governors, including Governor Francis Sargent, who was the governor that said no, finally was persuaded by folks. People said that is not the way for us. Boston was not the first city to say no to the interstate highway system. There were other cities that we learned from. There were folks in San Francisco, in the Embarcadero, we learned from them. There were folks in New Orleans who fought mightily, folks in Baltimore, folks all over the place who said, what can happen here? And a lot of those places lost. In Boston, we won in two ways. One, we stopped this road, right? So although you now have a traffic kind of disaster just trying to get around the city, but we have a walkability level that is enviable. In fact, the path of I-95 is now the path of the new Orange Line and the Southwest Corridor. Many of you know this 4.7-mile walkway. You can ride your bike, you can go to tot lots, you can play in a garden, you can do all these wonderful things that we now take for granted as being in livable cities, right? But what we can also claim fame, we could also call on and call as our claim to fame, a really important amendment that happened in 1973, the 1973 Federal Aid Highway Act. In that act, there is a provision called the Boston Provision. It's now called the Highway Transfer. The name was changed. But what the Boston Transfer Provision did is it meant that any governor in the United States could go to the legislature, go to Congress, and say, I don't want a highway, I want mass transit. So Boston was the first city to tap its own transfer provision, and that's how we get the expansion of mass transit. We got a new Orange Line, you all know, all those new stops from Forest Hills to Back Bay Station. We got that linear park on top, incredible. We also got the expansion of the Red Line. And so not only did the Red Line didn't just stop in Harvard, which is where it used to stop, it goes all the way out to Alewife. We also have an extension of the Red Line out to Braintree. And so we can talk about the way that the actual modern city was changed and reconfigured in our city because of citizen activism, because of their commitment to something else, to something more, and something more inclusive, dynamic, and radical. What was amazing to me in terms of researching the story was not only the ways that activism delivered this transformed landscape, was that so many of the people that I interviewed for this project, and I interviewed about 40 activists who were frontline leaders in the anti-highway fight over 30 years. And I asked them, and I said to them, you must be so pleased. You must be so pleased that you said no to the man, that you stopped the road, that you had victory. And so many folks said, we're not sure about that. And I thought, how's that possible? You stopped a $1 billion project in the middle of a time where people were needing jobs. There were all these economic crises in the city, and you said no because you said yes to something else. And what so many people said, and so many organizers and frontline leaders said, was that we were not mobilizing, one, because we thought we would win. We were mobilizing because we thought it was right. The fact that we won surprised us, shocked us, in fact, and we're still shocked. And I said, okay, but that's still good. That's still a good story. And folks said, but no, even though we were shocked, we were never fighting to stop a highway. This was never about transit. This was about opportunity and access and making the city more than it was willing to be. And so many people now who are in their 70s and 80s talk about how bittersweet they feel that victory has been. Because for so many of you who live and know that corridor, know the Southwest Corridor, and know so many of the development pressures that are still facing Roxbury in Dorchester and Jamaica Plain, so many of those activists said that if they knew that stopping a highway would unleash the gentrifying forces that would sweep through those neighborhoods and still have them in their grip, that they would have thought twice about marching on the State House, that they would have thought twice about meeting in basements and kitchen tables. And so that is a cautionary tale, if there is one, in terms of one, obviously we know there's no such thing as a slam dunk when you're fighting for a greater sense of equity and access, and you're trying to fight against a technocratic vision of what a city is supposed to be for the elite, for car owners at a time when only about 40% of the people in Boston had cars. When you're fighting for automobility and you're fighting for a fossil fuel-based future, when there seemed like there was no alternative to that because of the strength of the petroleum lobby and the strength of the car lobby and the car gang. And yet, people said, there's something else we can do. But right now, when we ask ourselves in 2023 what this means, I think there's still a question mark because there's still work to be done. So I just wanted to read a little bit of an excerpt here, because for me, the other lesson is, one, obviously there's more work to be done, but two, what does it mean when we think about something expansive, something as expansive as the civil rights movement itself and transit history? And we realize that these two histories are not so disconnected, that they're actually intertwined in how we understand our lives, our stories, and the landscapes that we inhabit. And so I think many of you now have this book. And so I hope you don't mind if I read just a little bit from page 16, if you have it. And it says here, I write, although America's civil rights history is often told as a growing series of citizenship claims aimed at fulfilling the 14th Amendment, many of its most defining battles have been waged in the context of transportation access. From Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which would federally institutionalize a policy of separate but equal based on a railroad riders petition, to the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, which challenged Alabama segregationist policies and catapulted Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence, to the Boynton Act of 1960, which outlawed separate accommodations for interstate travelers. The frontier of the U.S. civil rights movement has frequently been situated within a transportation-based legal fight. Even this cursory examination of America's transportation history recalls several definitive battlegrounds for securing constitutional protection and the rule of law for citizens constantly on the move. Transportation fights have consistently provided a legal platform for testing the constitutionality of racial separation and the constrained mobility that evidence its reach. In the end, trains, buses, and eventually cars, as well as the interstate roads that carried them, would prove essential cauldrons for expanding the meaning and relevance of American democracy. And so what I'm offering here is an opportunity for us to reflect on the ways that these stories, the stories of more inclusion, but a much more radical understanding of access and the ways that the movement of people through space, in addition to people being in space, being housed somewhere, when you have to move, it seems like every time we tell a story of movement, that we are broaching new ground in terms of what we will not allow. It's fine as long as someone does not sit next to me, does not live next to me, does not drive through my community. And so if we arrest and understand mobility and movement as essential to our humanity, as essential to our citizenship, what are the new fights and the new opportunities that we are gearing up to consider as we consider this question of abundance? So some of you know that earlier today, there was a press conference actually that I was involved in around the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of school desegregation in Boston. That commemoration is actually next year in 1974. And so in 1974, the buses rolled in Boston in response to the 1965 Racial Imbalance Act that had continued to put pressure on the Boston School Committee and the judiciary to really think about what it would mean to integrate the schools in Boston. This is the continuing battle and fight because of the intransigence of the residential segregation in our city. So busing as a Band-Aid solution was thrown into the faces of Bostonians in 1974. And you know the stories of violence, the story of resistance, the story of trauma that still sits in our midst. And so the city continues to be bruised by that history. I stand here a little bit as an embodiment of a multi-generational dream of educational access. My grandmother was one of the original plaintiffs in the Tallulah Morgan case, a group of Black mothers and parents that sued the Boston School Committee in 1974, and that led, in 1972, that led to school desegregation. And so for me, it is very powerful to think about two very different moments. The highway fight as a struggle also in the 1960s, where people came together to try to imagine a different kind of physical landscape, a different kind of economic landscape, a different kind of city. And just a few years later, in 1974, the city would actually experience some of the most horrific violence and the most horrific exposure of racial resistance in this country. Having Martin Luther King come to the city of Boston in 1965 and compare Boston to Selma and Mississippi and say that it seemed like even there was some movement and then some opportunity for Bostonians to listen. Sobering, but true. And so for us, as we think about space and we think about what is possible, again, this notion not only of abundance, but the radicalism. How radical are you willing to dream in terms of the dream of shared space, shared movement, shared humanity? Is that something that we can actually actualize in all aspects of our urban dwelling? Is that something that can be realized for a generation like mine, which is the post-civil rights generation? Today was the first day of school in many communities everywhere. And so as I was driving to campus, I was passing all of these school buses, as many of you were, I'm sure. And so it is always notable to me that on the first day of school, of a new semester, of a new year, all of these little people who are so excited for what is possible for them. And in many ways, little do they know that it's actually people in this room, it's the adults. It is our job to hold that sense of possibility, that sense of sharing in abundance. And so I'm grateful to be here tonight because I think we are being bold, and I think we have to be bold on the first day of school. And so I hope that the lessons of history, the lessons of the folks that fought to stop the highway, the lessons of our scholars that teach us that the government has done so much on purpose, that we have to have the will, political, economic, and social will to call out those lies and myths and do right. And so I look forward to the questions and the conversation because the stakes are high and it's on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kariyln. Would you like to join me on the stage along with Richard for a Q&A? We'll take some audience questions. If you guys have any, I'll also ask some questions myself. So if you could please join me up here. Come out? Okay. Thank you. Do we have another one? Another microphone? I could pass it to them. All right. All right, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you both. I think that was really informative, and I think everybody learned a little something here. But we'll take audience questions in just a minute. So if you guys have questions, please start thinking of them now. I just had a couple questions, and I know that we've already we don't have that much time. But Richard, I just wanted to start with you. Actually, on that chapter that you mentioned was your favorite chapter, also happened to be my favorite chapter, which is really interesting because it actually talks about challenges the idea that the Supreme Court is the ultimate decider of what is constitutional and not. That is not in the Constitution. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you're calling here for some civil disobedience or the equivalent of civil disobedience, that you are encouraging municipalities, politicians, activists to actually defy the Supreme Court if it starts to strike down more and more race-based policies. Can you talk a little bit more about why there's a need to defy the Supreme Court's decisions in this day and age?
Well, I think if you look at the history of constitutional law in this country, you'll have to recognize that the Supreme Court has absolutely no credibility when it comes to issues of race. There's a lot of talk about how the Constitution was written to protect slavery, and it was. There were many clauses in the Constitution that protected slavery. But in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, we passed the 13th and 14th Amendments. The 13th and 14th Amendments made the Constitution the most radically democratic document in world history. It still is. Had those two amendments, the 13th and 14th in particular, been observed, if they had not been annihilated by the Supreme Court beginning in the 1870s, we would have a racially egalitarian society today. It's a big thing to think about. In the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. It also authorized Congress to prohibit the reflections of slavery, what the badges and incidents of slavery. There's any form of second-class citizenship. In 1866, Congress passed a law prohibiting discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, prohibiting discrimination in any kind of property transaction, prohibiting discrimination in any walk of American life pursuant to the 13th Amendment. In 1875, the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional, just a few years after the 13th Amendment had been adopted. And since that time, it has continued on a 150-year path to annihilate the plain meaning and intent of those amendments that made it such a radical document. Now, it's only liberals who have such enormous awe for the Supreme Court. Conservatives don't have it. Roe v. Wade became constitutional law in, was it 1972, was it? And shortly after that, the state of Pennsylvania defied it. They passed Casey. They passed the law that was reviewed in Casey. And since that time, conservatives have been defying the Supreme Court in one case after another. Now, recently, the Supreme Court, as you know, prohibited affirmative action in college admissions. I think it's my view, and I've been writing about this. I think you mentioned that we have a regular column, Leah, my daughter and I, that update and comment on new events and new developments subsequent to the publication of this big book on June 1st. So we have to be writing about the Supreme Court decision. I think that courageous college administrators should continue to practice affirmative action. Just as the state of Pennsylvania didn't accept Roe only a few years after it was adopted. It should be challenged. It should be chipped away at. And the same thing, it's even more important when it comes to housing, because we're not going to be able to enact desegregated housing in any form unless, as I said in my remarks, we're racially explicit about it. We need to give preferences to African Americans to access housing from which they've historically been unconstitutionally excluded. So, the chapter title probably goes a little bit far, a little bit dramatic. Leah's very good at coming up with dramatic titles, but
it's a good idea.
The idea of it is correct, I think. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask Kariyln a question, then I'm going to move to the audience. But Kariyln, you talked about this a little bit, but one thing I'm interested in today, learning from the highway resistance movements in the past, there are a lot of cities that are now actually demolishing these highways that were built. My sister lives in Syracuse. There's a big project there. DC has one highway that they're just demolishing part of, turning into a boulevard. What role does that have now in the fight for more fair housing? How much should people focus their effort on undoing highways, or is it something that we're just going to have to live with? Like, is there a way out of all these highways that were built and destroyed a lot of American cities?
Well, I think that the Biden-Harris White House has been very clear about calling out structural racism and white supremacy in the context of highway development. Unfortunately, we missed the boat in terms of the size of the Infrastructure Act and funding. And so that is because of the dysfunction of Congress and everything else. And so there is a lack of leadership, I would say, that's legislative, but also executive. There's more to be done there. So this piece that you're pointing out to definitely speaks to the ways that Secretary Buttigieg has been very forthright in saying that there's work to be done to repair communities that have been dissected and bisected by highways. The reality is the funding is not there to actually reconnect and repair economically or socially the cities that have been harmed. But it's a bigger conversation that's there in terms of the government's responsibility in repairing harm, which probably could never be repaired. And so communities like Syracuse that you mentioned, communities even in New Orleans, I'm thinking about the work along the Highway 10 and what that did to the Treme, and how the community there continues to try to mobilize itself, not just to focus on highway repair and redevelopment, but to understand the cultural bounds and binds that are made possible because of the physicality of the neighborhood, irrespective of the 10. Similarly, there's a community I've been working with in Rochester, New York, who also a community that was devastated by a highway route that continues to have an annual summer reunion. The Clarissa Street neighborhood in the Rock or in Rochester is a really incredible place that says, we are a proud community. And even though this road came and ripped up our neighborhood needlessly, and in fact never delivered on the goods that the governor had demanded, that this would bring more people into the city, that it would bring more economic activity, did not happen. So I'm also fascinated not just by what the government's response is that you allude to, but also how communities on the ground have actually recommitted themselves to some of the generational connections and some of the stories and some of the history in terms of mobilizing, but also just people staying together at a time where we're 83% of people in this country live in cities. And so now the expectation to live in a city, to walk in your neighborhood, to know your neighborhood, to be able to raise your child, your grandchild, and have them come back, there's a different kind of cultural expectation for what it means to be here. So I wonder what that federal funding in terms of the highway repair looks like, because some of it is actually out of step with what communities are saying that they want and need at this time, which is not just about repairing a highway, but actually throwing out the blueprint for what we expect our urban landscape to be for now and 2 and 3 generations into the future. I wonder about that because there are more people who are actually demanding to be in cities, people who are older, people who are midlife, and we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the transit plan to make that happen. And so in that case, the U.S. can learn and to look abroad for sure.
So I want to turn over to the audience and we'll pass over a mic. Is there somebody? Start with you. I don't think we can hear that.
Hi, my name is Miriam Ashkenazi. I'm a select board member for the town of Brookline, as Mr. Rothstein knows, because I hounded him before. As you know, Brookline is currently having a heated debate on how to comply with the MBTCA Communities Act. You referred to it in your comments. Town meeting will vote in November on either compliance to allow for zoning changes and increase housing and access to housing, or paper compliance, or nothing. I'm an activist, but at heart, I'm a practical person. So if I'm speaking to a town meeting member, what do I say to them so I get them to support this zoning change if equity is not their central driving force? I mean, I just got to get it passed, right? We got to get it done. So that's, I'm looking for any advice. Thank you.
Well, I can't give you advice. You're much, you were elected because you're better at this than I am. I'm just a scribe, I don't, but I will say, I want to emphasize what I said before. If we're going to, I'm concerned about the apartheid system that we have in this country. Certainly, the kind of zoning reform that the state is requiring is a first step, but it's only a first step. And there's a lot of, I think, fantasy on the part of racial justice advocates who think that simply because we increase density, we're going to increase opportunities for African Americans to live in better housing. And it won't happen because we have a housing shortage that is not just racial. It's across the class spectrum and across the racial groups. And so unless we go farther than simply increasing density along transit corridors as the state requires, we may solve some of the economic problem that mostly white families face in finding housing. But we're not going to address racial segregation. And so if our concern is racial segregation, we've got to go farther. Well, the biggest problem that Brookline has, in my view, is single family zoning throughout the town, not just the problem. And if we concentrate all of the low-income people in a new segregated area along transit stops, that's not going to help to desegregate Brookline.
Well, I wanted to follow up on that because in your book, you and your daughter, co-author, you guys make a clear effort to make a distinction between black-white residential segregation versus the segregation between white people and other groups like Latinos and Asians. That there is a unique nature to the black-white segregation that requires policymakers to address that specifically. Can you expand on that difference between the black-white segregation and other minority groups?
Sure. The policies that I described in The Color of Law, and I talked about this evening, were explicitly directed towards African Americans. In places like Massachusetts, like Boston, in the 20th century, when these policies were enacted, African Americans were the only non-white population that was here. It wasn't a big Asian population. It wasn't a Hispanic population. This is not who it was directed against. These policies were explicitly directed to segregate Black people. Now, once you create this system of segregation, new immigrants are going to find themselves faced with the same kinds of neighborhood divisions. But they're not there because the government segregated them. They're there because that's where the only opportunities for them to live are at this point. So if we want to redress the unconstitutional system that we have to focus particularly on the people who are unconstitutionally segregated and not those who have fallen in subsequently to this unequal situation. Now, certainly, other minority groups, other low-income groups will benefit from any policies that we enact that increase equality in our housing. And for example, we spent a lot of time in the book, I didn't get to talk about it this evening, for example, about increasing mobility programs for low-income families into higher opportunity communities. Those kinds of programs will benefit particularly Hispanics as well as African Americans. So, but they weren't, the Hispanics aren't segregated in Boston the way African Americans were.
Yeah. And Kariyln, did you have any thoughts about how to convince people to answer the original question, how to convince people who might be resistant to zoning changes that maybe don't center on equity, you said? How would you?
Absolutely. Well, first I want to just commend the use of the word equity. So some of you know that I was the city of Boston's first chief of equity in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. The city like Boston as a city and so many cities around the country were really forced to think about what were their policy priorities, what were the government structures that were in place to think about a word like equity. And so if equity demands us to think about not only a corrective action, but also how do you address outcomes? How do you address not only what's happening to folks on the front end of a policy, but on the outcome side of it? And so I think a conversation around racial capitalism, which is a conversation that we're having as a global phenomenon, really questions how we even understand the idea of who's being minoritized. And so when we think about the global majority, that's who we're talking about, and how these policies actually create the sense of who is minoritized is something to question, and also to challenge ourselves again in this notion of how do we share space and those resources for folks, and at the level of policy, enacted policy around equity. The work that I was engaged in with the city of Boston was trying to define equity across all of the city's 60 departments, and how to think about that with an economic lens. And there's great limitations in terms of what a municipal government can do. But I think without clear leaders and clear actions on the ground supported by government structures, that there's no clarity. If I asked everyone in this room, in fact, to define the word equity, I promise you I would probably get as many different definitions as there are people here. And so it's not only defining the word, but defining what that actually looks like in action. The conversation on housing is, it just seems like a place where we dare not go. And we fall back on the idea of production side economics as a solve, and we know that's not it. This idea that if we just make more housing, that's going to solve the segregation issue, it's going to solve the economic issue without actually redressing how and where we live right now. That's a longer term game, but I feel like many of our political leaders, particularly in the city of Boston, because the population of our region is growing, because of what I was saying before about the expectation of more people, people are expecting to live in the city. And so I do think this is a moment of intense pressure because of the question around equity and the question around population growth, and what that means for older places like Brookline. What is the longer term vision for what housing actually does look like on the policy side of the conversation, but also economically? Can there be an articulation of a vision that matches up to the challenge is a question, but something I think has to be grounded in the idea of equity as a value, as an action, and as an outcome. So just want to thank you for bringing that up. I don't have an answer, but I'm really super heartened by the fact that there's a seriousness in terms of the conversation that's here and the question that you raised.
Does anybody else have a question? Also, I want to be mindful of the time, so maybe two more questions after this one. I'm sorry, I saw somebody here had a question. Was it?
My question is to Mr. Rothstein. My name is Gloria Coney. Years ago, I was actually a part of Tent City, Stop the Movement here. And so early on, you mentioned civil disobedience. I'm not sure that I understand what that means today. Can you give us your description, your meaning of civil disobedience?
Well, I actually think it was Abdullah who said civil disobedience, not me. But
was.
I do think, I want to emphasize again that we cannot solve our racial problems by pretending that they're not racial. And we have got to be intentional about the creation of housing opportunities for African Americans in places from which they've historically been excluded. The current Supreme Court is likely to prohibit it, and it will take a long time to turn that around. But we can't turn it around if we simply passively accept Supreme Court rulings and don't try to come up with new rationales. For example, and I know we're short on time, but real quickly on this recent decision about affirmative action in higher education, what the Supreme Court prohibited was a policy that colleges and universities were following to give preferences to African Americans for purposes of diversity. In other words, it would be a good idea to get more African Americans in college classes because white students would learn better if they had African American classmates. That was the rationale. What should now happen is we should return to a more reasonable and important rationale for affirmative action, and do it as a remedy for past unconstitutional exclusion. That's a different kind of rationale, and we should start a new chain of litigation. We probably will lose, but we'll get some dissents from some justices. We'll get some lower court decisions in our favor, and gradually, hopefully, build up the basis for a transformation. I hate to use the abolition of abortion as a model, but they were not intimidated the way we're intimidated by Supreme Court rulings.
So we're going to ask one more question and then wrap things up. I'm going to come to you, Deborah. I heard you had a question.
Hi, my name is Deborah Brown, and I'm the board president for the Brookline Community Development Corporation. And I wanted to say two things really quickly first, that when you look at wealth in the greater Boston area, the 2015 Boston Federal Reserve study that said that Black people had $8 worth of wealth and the average white family had $250,000. And that was because they owned their own home. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and it gets to the question that I want to ask is, you know, in this beautiful suburb of Brookline, I came across some statistics that said that, you know, we have 50 unhoused students in our schools. You know, they're living in shelters, and it gets back to that broader question of if Johnny doesn't have a stable home, Johnny's not going to learn. And all of the social determinants of health just begin to weigh them down. My question gets at, how do we as suburban communities become radicalized such that we're not just talking about Boston. We're not just talking about Framingham or Worcester, but we're talking about our very community as our survival, as our integrity. And I guess I'm asking if y'all have, I'm from Texas, if y'all have some examples of how to create that fire in the belly and that inspiration that is sustainable, not a flash in the pan, but that's sustainable. So.
Thank you, Deborah.
Solution.
So which one of you wants to take that on?
You know, I'm not sufficiently familiar with this community to give you specific advice, but the first step is education. The first step is creating biracial, multi-ethnic committees. I think you've been doing that are going to be an ongoing, and conduct ongoing campaigns to redress segregation. And the second step is to figure out ways of educating the rest of the community, because in answer to your question before about how to persuade people who are not persuaded, the best way to begin the process is to educate them about the context and the history of how this happened. Because I think the biggest bar, I've said this before, the biggest bar to having successful movement to reform is the notion that it happened by accident. I find this whole topic very hopeful, because if it happened deliberately, it can unhappen deliberately. And that's the first thing we have to understand. Now, how you conduct that education, I don't know. It seems to me that there are many churches and other houses of faith in Brookline. You ought to have people going out to them and offering to conduct educational programs for them about the history of how the community came to be a mostly segregated community. You need to be writing letters to the editor. You need to be writing op-eds. And is there a local newspaper in this area? You need to be writing for them and explaining this history. Those are all the things that begin to create the basis for a movement. And from there, you need to have an action campaign. And as I said, I don't know where you start, but there are dozens and dozens of actions that you can take in this community and in the broader community. Obviously, Brookline is not isolated, and in the broader community to address this problem.
Yeah, so just echoing the point of our history, which for me is never even history. It's just kind of understanding the set of intentions that some of which are still with us that are ordering where we live. I think even just thinking about for how the landscape for me is littered with all these incredible stories of people saying, no, we can do something different. Even the waterfront, the cleanup of the waterfront, to understand that that was citizens suing an intransigent government who said, we don't care if the Charles River is polluted. We don't care if the harbor is polluted. What? And so that people in a room like this sat and talked and organized and took that on. Even the desegregation of Boston Housing Authority, residents in the NAACP suing the BHA in 1962 to make integration possible. The highway fight that I talked about. I mean, we have this thing of self-government in Massachusetts in particular, with what 351 cities and towns. Everyone wants to sort of be their own thing, which maybe is great, but there is maybe a problem because of some of the housing issues we have for sure. But this idea that this kind of group, the what it means to bring committed citizens together is something that still sounds sometimes, when I mention to students, sort of hokey, but it is actually the fuel of some of our best victories. Our best success stories are always stories that people said it was not possible or we don't think we can win, but it's got to be that doubling down on it. So I would say know the history and keep this room going and growing. That's got to be it. I feel absolutely encouraged by the conversation and heartened, in fact. So thank you.
Thank you both. And Deborah, actually, your question did remind me of one quote, another quote from Dr. King, which I think it goes to both of their points about education and understanding what really goes on. You know, here in the north of the country, in the Union, historically the Union, there's a chip on our shoulder as to how deep the racism goes here. And actually, there are two things later in Dr. King's life that made him deeply unpopular before he was assassinated. One was his opposition to the war in Vietnam. The other thing was actually going to the North and advocating for fair and free housing, fair and open housing. He went to Chicago. And when he went to Chicago, in one of the events that he was organizing at, there was a mob that was shouting to kill him, and they started to throw rocks at him. And when he was asked about it, and this was after Selma, after Montgomery, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not the Fair Housing Act one of 68, but the first one. This was after all of that. He said, quote, "I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago." Northern liberals started to turn on King like that. That history has not entirely been gone. And sometimes here in places like Massachusetts or in Maryland or wherever, we forget that this was part and parcel of segregation in America. So education really is, I think, a great note to end this all on. So thank you. I want to thank you both for joining us today. And I know that we have to turn over to one more person. There we go. To talk about the communities action we can take next. But thank you, Richard. Thank you, Kariyln, both. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And thank you for everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been a long night, so I'm not going to keep you much longer. I absolutely promise. This is the wind up, and this is the call to action, because we've learned so much tonight, and that's great. And I am indebted to our speakers and to our moderator. Thank you very much. But it doesn't mean squat if we don't do something about it. All right. So my name is Jonathan Klein. I know many of you here. I'm delighted to have you. I'm a member here at Temple Beth Zion. I'm a board member of Brookline for Everyone, one of the co-sponsors. And we stand for a Brookline that is diverse, welcoming, and affordable. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So I want to start with thank yous. First to Rabbi Tiferet, for leading us off with her personal story and her welcome, to Richard Rothstein and Dr. Kariyln Crockett, and to our wonderful moderator, thank you, to Abdallah Fayyad. We really appreciate your expertise, your time, and your energy tonight in sharing words with us. Second, to Abundant Housing Massachusetts, an amazing organization, especially their associate director, Cassie Infante, who was the organizer of all this. And importantly, for their financial sponsorship, which made the wonderful food downstairs available and made this whole event possible. So thank you to them. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors, and Rabbi Tiferet mentioned all of them at the beginning, so I'm not going to go through them all again in the interest of time, but we had 9 co-sponsors, which is really an amazing coming together of organizations, many of which I am part of and have worked with, that care about housing and racial equity in Massachusetts. So what can we do to take just action? Okay, that's the question. And I have 5 suggestions, okay? I'm told you should always do lists in 3s or 5s. So I couldn't keep it to 3, I've got 5, all right? So first I have a great announcement. You might remember we said that the first 100 people who came would get a free copy of each book. And it turns out some of those people didn't show tonight, shame on them. So we have some extra books out back. So if you have not gotten your book, please take a copy of either or both of the books. Mr. Rothstein and Dr. Crockett's books, they're out there. But don't just take them, read them, okay? It's about learning. And we heard a lot tonight, but if you don't read them and really get it, shame on you. So so I really, really encourage that. And I will also, I wrote down here, learning is a first prerequisite to action. Okay, you both said that up here. We need to learn our history, and then we can take just action. So I will also say, here at Temple Beth Zion, we're going to do a book read over like 4 weeks. Every week, we're going to meet for a lunch and learn, and we're going to read Just Action, and we're going to then talk about it and see what we can learn from it. If anybody else wants to do something like that, that's just for our members, see me, and I'd be happy to help you organize that at your own institution or somewhere else. I think that's a great way to learn together. So that was number 1. Number 2, if you haven't done it already, join Abundant Housing Massachusetts. They are a great organization. They can use your membership. They have a great newsletter and legislative updates and calls to action, right? They will email you and say, this is happening in the legislature. This vote is coming up. We need your help. Letters and calls to legislatures matter. People think they don't. They matter. The legislatures get it, right? So please do that. I will mention 2 things that they're doing that are important this weekend. They have like a full roster. They're going full steam. On Saturday from 3 to 6, they have a free 3-hour training in Arlington called Advocacy Training for Town Meeting Communities like Brookline or Arlington or Milton or other communities that have town meetings. And that is free. It's with Kristen Halbert. And it also has free food, by the way. And on Sunday in Newton, they are having by Zoom at 7 o'clock, how to testify to city council. So you can go to their website. The program you have there has QR codes. You can go to the QR code. It's their website. And you can get information about both those. Okay, that was 2. Third, if you live in Brookline, this is about joining. I'm a joiner, okay? I belong to a lot of organizations. Join Brookline for Everyone, okay? There's a QR code in the program. You'll get our weekly newsletter, and you can join in our advocacy for passing our compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, which is really, really important. It is a start. It is not the end. It is a start to expand housing accessibility and affordability by building more housing in Brookline, which is a transit-friendly community. I'll just mention, the MBTA Communities Act is not just about rapid transit. It is about any community that has any kind of available public transit. It actually covers 177 communities out of the 351 in Massachusetts. So it covers half the state. But Brookline is really important. We need to build more housing. There's a lot of opposition and challenge to that. So please join us. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to take 2 more minutes and tell you a little bit about that. Most of you know this already, but the state is requiring us to comply by building more multifamily housing near transit. and that is almost all of North Brookline. We have to do that by December 31st. Our select board, under the leadership of, among others, Miriam Ashkenazi, who is here, thank you very much, has put forward a proposal that we at Brookline for Everyone, and I personally think is excellent. It will rezone our entire Harvard Street corridor. It will allow at least 800 more units of housing to be built. About 120 or 130 of those will be affordable. It will rezone a public housing site that will allow it to double in capacity, to create more deeply affordable housing. It will be a good start on what we need to do to create potential abundance in housing so people of all incomes and races can live in this wonderful community. So you need to support that. To support that, you need to figure out who to work with. And if you get on our newsletter, we will tell you that every week. I sometimes write the newsletter, and we'll give you information about what to do, how to learn more about it, how to lobby your town meeting members, and how to get action. This is coming up at our town meeting on November 14th is when town meetings start. So we only have 3 months to get this passed. We need a 2/3 majority, and we need every single person's help who is a Brookline resident here. So do that. That was number 3. Okay. On the same theme, 4, this is kind of the same point, but I made it 4, okay? On October 2nd, GBIO, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, which has 60, yay, GBIO, has 60 faith institutions and others around Boston, including TBZ, including our other co-sponsors, United Parish in Brookline and Temple Sinai, is holding a training for people that want to learn how to work in Brookline with us to get the MBTA Communities Act compliance passed. So there's a brochure about that or a leaflet about that with Jane Daniels out at the back door. If you're in Brookline, take one. It is open to everyone, not just GBIO members. We'd love to have you come to learn more about how to do that. That was 4. And finally, 5th, coming back home, if you're a TBZ member, and we would love you to join us in our Tikkun Olam work, our housing justice work, our racial equity work, see me or see Jane or Rosalind Jaffe who's here or Rachel Goodman who's here. You can all put up your hands and we'd love to get you engaged. So wherever you are, and if you're in other communities, Boston and Newton and Cambridge and Somerville, and if you'd like to know ways to connect with the activities going on in your communities around housing and the MBTA Communities Act, contact me. I'll be happy to point you to those places, or contact Abundant Housing MA and Cassie and her team, and they would be happy to help. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been a long night. We appreciate your attention. Have a great evening.